In this podcast episode, Konstantin, Kisin, and Steve Keen engage in a broad-ranging conversation touching on pressing global issues. Themes include political polarization, economic stagnation, immigration, climate change, energy policy, geopolitical tensions, the rise of populism, differing governance models, and the transformative but potentially existential risks posed by artificial intelligence. Both guests offer candid, sometimes contrasting perspectives rooted in their backgrounds and expertise. The dialogue opens with concerns over intense political division in the Western world. Konstantin warns that economic difficulties, combined with social instability and cultural anxieties, are fostering an unprecedented level of separation between people, which almost inevitably leads to civil unrest and violence. He points to the rise of far-right and far-left populism, particularly in Europe, fueled by economic stagnation and cultural anxieties around immigration. Illegal immigration, especially large influxes of economic migrants via irregular routes, is framed as a catalyst for backlash, with the political class losing control over border enforcement. The conversation highlights how failure to address migration and economic issues fuels extremist political discourse. Konstantin stresses that while empathy for migrants fleeing conflict exists, the majority arriving into Western countries today are economic migrants seeking better lives. This creates friction in societies facing economic stagnation and demographic changes, leading to political pushback. The UK's expenditure on accommodating illegal immigrants is cited as unsustainable, with demands growing for stricter border control and the removal of benefits and social housing access for foreign nationals. The point is made that enforcing incentives can influence migrant behavior, and without this, polarizing sentiments on immigration will persist or worsen. Economic stagnation, especially in Europe since the 2008 financial crisis, is identified as a root cause of social and political instability. Stagnant growth undermines public confidence and exacerbates polarization. Both guests contrast Europe's slower growth with the dynamic nature of the U.S. economy, where cultural factors such as a can-do attitude and a more entrepreneurial mindset support better economic performance despite less public welfare support. The high cost of energy and infrastructure challenges in Europe further hobble growth prospects. The discussion critiques austerity policies, reduced public investment, and the privatization of key services, which hinder productive economic activity. The climate crisis forms a significant portion of the discussion. Steve Keen argues that mainstream economics has trivialized the impact of global warming, underestimating its threat to civilization. They discuss the inadequacy of current political responses and the futility of individual nations like the UK in addressing global emissions, given the continued growth of carbon output in major countries like China and India. Instead, the emphasis should be on adaptation measures such as flood defenses, alongside the development of abundant, affordable, and clean energy sources to sustain economic prosperity. Contrasting views emerge on whether climate change can be meaningfully mitigated without global coordination or world government. Konstantin advocates for innovation in clean energy technologies as the realistic path forward, while Steve stresses that without coordinated global reduction in energy use, catastrophic breakdowns may be inevitable. The conversation also touches on historic climate variability and humanity's need to adapt to changing conditions. Turning to global politics, the guests examine recent developments in the Middle East, particularly tensions involving Iran and the strategic Strait of Hormuz. They agree that U.S. interventions have complicated the region and enriched adversaries like Iran and Russia, contributing to sustained geopolitical instability. The resulting disruptions to oil, gas, and fertilizer supplies have global economic repercussions, including rising food insecurity. Steve Keen predicts an impending global famine exacerbated by shortages of key agricultural inputs like fertilizer. The solution proposed is a U.S. withdrawal from Middle Eastern entanglements to prevent empowering hostile regional actors, although the complexity and unpredictability of the situation are acknowledged. A layered debate unfolds about the comparative merits of political systems. Konstantin, with personal experience of the Soviet Union, expresses clear opposition to communism and highlights its economic failures due to lack of incentives and central planning inefficiencies. However, He acknowledges China's hybrid system, which combines state-owned infrastructure provision with thriving private sector innovation. This mixed model, despite political repression and restrictions on freedoms, has delivered substantial economic growth and rising living standards, albeit with compromises on civil liberties. Steve is more skeptical of China's political system, pointing to authoritarian features, suppression of dissent, and the absence of genuine private enterprise. However, he notes the inadequacies of Western systems, such as mass incarceration in the US and failing public infrastructure in the UK. Both agree that the Chinese model's focus on long-term infrastructure development contributes to its economic success, contrasting with short-term driven Western democracies. The discussion touches on the resurgence of socialist ideas, particularly in the US, where younger generations increasingly support policies that echo democratic socialism. Konstantin argues that democratic socialism effectively mirrors communism, criticizing its track record of stifling innovation and creating economic stagnation. He warns that redistributing wealth by taxing the productive disincentivizes enterprise and results in widespread poverty. Steve offers a more nuanced view on economic policy, advocating for a balanced approach where government spending on productive infrastructure and public goods can enable private sector growth. They critique welfare systems that inadvertently discourage work or productivity, highlighting the incentives embedded in social policy that shape behavior. Both acknowledge the need to rethink economic policy for future prosperity. Wokeism is addressed as a social phenomenon, emphasizing identity-based hierarchies of oppression and victimhood. Konstantin characterizes it as a divisive force that judges people by group identity rather than individual merit, focusing on feelings over effective policy. They contrast this with the necessity of prioritizing pragmatic solutions to social and economic challenges rather than catering to emotional or ideological agendas. The latter part of the conversation turns to artificial intelligence, AI, as a transformative and existential issue. Both guests recognize AI's potential to revolutionize economies, displacing many jobs and potentially leading to universal basic income or automated wealth redistribution. Steve Keen stresses that governments will need mechanisms to provide incomes in a world where machines perform most labor, cautioning against simplistic reliance on taxation that might stifle economic activity. Konstantin fears the creation of a superior intelligence, a new species, that could render humanity obsolete, comparing humans to pets or livestock in a worst-case scenario. They debate whether AI can be programmed with empathy or maternal instincts to protect humans, but remain skeptical such safeguards can be guaranteed. The race to develop advanced AI is driven by commercial and military imperatives, with little expectation of slowing down despite potential risks. Both express a philosophical acceptance that no one can ultimately control these developments. Instead, they advocate focusing on living meaningful lives amid uncertainty while continuing to engage in public discourse about the associated challenges. The episode closes with reflections on current political leadership, particularly in the UK, under newly appointed Prime Minister Andy Burnham. Konstantin is pessimistic about Burnham's capacity to execute transformative change, believing that deep structural and cultural challenges will persist regardless. They emphasize the need for policies that prioritize cheap, abundant energy, robust infrastructure, and clear immigration enforcement to restore societal stability. Throughout, the dialogue underscores the complexities of contemporary crises, highlighting the interplay between economics, politics, technology, and societal values shaping an uncertain future.